Hi there, I'm so glad you made it here. I'm the Discerning Clerk, and I like to deconstruct movies through a biblical framework, and that is my typical fare. But I'm also a former video store clerk and self-proclaimed cinephile who still holds movies as an important part of art and expression. In an effort to promote home viewing and owning the physical media, I'd like to make recommendations in the form of a top 5 list. Today, I'm forming my list of top 5 sequels. The basis for this category is storytelling that happens over subsequent films and not preferring the first film. Everything I say is just my preference and opinion. It's okay if you have a different preference or opinion than me. I'd love to have you share your recommendations in the comments rather than shaming me for mine. So in no particular order, I give you the Discerning Clerk's top 5 sequels. And since we have to start somewhere, I'm starting in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which really could be a category unto itself. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a better storyline with firmly established characters. Released in 2017, only 3 years after the original, writer-director James Gunn assembled his original cast, which is just as ragtag as the characters they play. Chris Pratt really came into his own as Star-Lord Peter Quill, alongside Zoe Saldana and Dave Bautista, featuring the voice talents of Bradley Cooper and Vin Diesel, returning as the original Guardians, with Baby Groot being one of the cutest things to come out of the MCU. This one introduces us to Peter's biological father, Ego, played by the illustrious Kurt Russell, and his offspring servant, Mantis, giving us a wonderful comedic duo with her and Drax. Family matters feature large throughout, with Gamora's sister Nebula and their adopted father Thanos making bigger strides in the meta story. And Peter reconciles his difficult upbringing with demented space ranger Yondu, and ultimately must decide if his loyalty is to his bloodline or to his adoption. The sequel has more cohesion than the others in the trilogy, and a more satisfying arc for significant characters. The soundtrack also pops off more here, being more in line with the story rather than working against it. Next is Ghostbusters 2. This one was hard because the original is just so iconic, and the remakes and reboots are equally awful and awesome. Afterlife, for example, is good, but doesn't compare to the original, and the all-female remake is terribly unwatchable. Ghostbusters 2 brings back the original cast featuring Bill Murray, writers Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, Sigourney Weaver, and even Rick Moranis and Annie Potts. Released in 1989, 5 years after the first one, and directed by Ivan Reitman, has the addition of Ernie Hudson and Dana's baby. This story tells us of the success of the Ghostbusters working as exorcists in New York City, and the supernatural activity doesn't stop in the city that never sleeps. Dan Aykroyd actually comes from a family of practicing occultists, and he includes much of the truth in his script writing and storytelling. So this might be a good one to deconstruct for that reason, but in the meantime, we can all enjoy the one-liners from Peter Venkman and remember when King Charles was commissioned as the Vigo. Coming in hot with comedy satire trilogy, Austin Powers, and my preferred third installment, Goldmember. Austin Powers was initially released in 1997 as a James Bond satire featuring Canadian funny man Mike Myers. It poked fun at so many British spy tropes that it became a trope in itself. And by the third one, they really own that fact. Goldmember comes 5 years after the original in 2002, and the leading man plays multiple lead roles as the title character, the main villain, Dr. Evil, the former villain, Fat Bastard, and the new villain, Goldmember. Beyonce is the leading lady in this one, and she's even cast as introducing Beyonce Knowles. She was only 21 at the time and manages to squeeze out an adequate performance, if awkward at times. Likewise, Michael Caine as the senior Powers, taking his turn at comedy, leaves us with an underwhelming result. But it's also British charming and funny that we can forgive nearly any cinematic sin. Which leads me to a near-perfect story that surprised and delighted audiences when it was released 15 years after the original. It's the third installment of the animated classic and ongoing anthology, Toy Story. Sheriff Woody, Buzz Lightyear, Ham, Rex, Bo, Mr. Potato Head, and Slinky Dog were all introduced to us in 1995, with Jessie, Barbie, Mrs. Potato Head, and Bullseye joining the cast only 2 years later. These characters not only spoke to our childhood and created a sense of nostalgia, but we were also blown away by the cutting-edge animation coming out of Pixar studios. Tom Hanks and Tim Allen truly bring the toys to life, searing them in our hearts and minds. Toy Story 3, as I said, comes 15 years later. Andy is grown and headed to college with no more need for his childhood toys. But we know that toys exist to be played with. And Andy's toys get new life with preschooler Bonnie after a traumatic bonding experience at a daycare. Lotso the bear is a very well-written villain, with Big Baby being both terrifying and pitiable. It also makes me wonder if Ryan Gosling was inspired in his performance of Ken Doll by Michael Keaton's portrayal in this one. Finally, for something completely different, the sequel that surpasses the original for me, in my opinion, is Kill Bill Volume 2. Written and directed by Quentin Tarantino, starring Uma Thurman as the bride who sets out from the beginning to kill Bill, played by David Carradine. Kill Bill Volume 1 was released in 2003, and the sequel only 1 year later. Being a Tarantino flick, both installments are riddled with extreme violence, profanity, and bloodshed. But his storytelling is really unmatched in the industry, and I found the latter half of the volumes to be more compelling, but only slightly. It helped to relaunch the career of Daryl Hannah and features Tarantino favorite Michael Madsen and a slew of talented B actors. Since it was written and filmed as one continuous story, the sequel cannot stand on its own, and watching Volume 1 is required viewing. But if you have 4 hours to steep yourself in such a story, I highly recommend it. As for me, I'll be watching Toy Story 3 tonight for family movie night. Let me know in the comments what you're watching tonight, and what sequels and subsequent films make your top 5 list. Membership is free, so subscribe if you want to, but don't follow me. Follow the one who saves you. And until next time, keep looking up.
Mole, 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 mole.